68%. That's the share of the world's new factory construction that is happening inside China right now. Not Asia, not developing countries, China alone. At the same time, the United States, the country that once defined industrial power, is spending years debating permits for projects that haven't even broken ground yet. Think about how strange that sounds. One nation is pouring concrete, installing machines, connecting power lines, and hiring workers. The other is still reviewing paperwork. And before anyone says this is another China is winning, America is losing story, that's actually not what makes this interesting. The real story is much deeper. Because factories are not buildings, they're timelines. Every factory represents a future product, a future supply chain, a future export market, and thousands of future jobs. When a country builds a factory today, it's really placing a bet on what the world will need 5 years from now. And right now, China is placing more bets than anyone else. The scale is difficult to grasp. Whether we're talking about electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, industrial robots, chemicals, advanced materials, or components most people never think about, China has entered a construction phase that resembles what America experienced during some of its most transformative industrial decades. What's fascinating is that this wasn't supposed to happen. A few years ago, many analysts expected rising labor costs, geopolitical tensions, and trade restrictions to slow Chinese manufacturing expansion. There was a widespread assumption that production would gradually disperse across Southeast Asia, India, Mexico, and other emerging economies. Some of it did. But then something unexpected happened. China didn't just keep building. It accelerated. In sector after sector, provincial governments began supporting industrial parks, transportation links, power infrastructure, and manufacturing clusters designed to reduce costs and increase efficiency. A company looking to build a battery factory isn't simply getting a plot of land. It's often getting suppliers nearby, ports nearby, rail links nearby, workers nearby, the entire ecosystem nearby. That distinction matters more than most headlines acknowledge, because manufacturing is rarely about a single factory. It's about what surrounds it. A battery plant next to chemical suppliers, machine tool companies, logistics centers, and engineering talent becomes dramatically more productive than a factory standing alone. This is why some countries successfully attract factories, but struggle to create lasting industrial ecosystems. They get the building, China gets the network, and networks are harder to replicate. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America faces a very different challenge. To be fair, the United States is investing heavily in manufacturing. The CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and multiple industrial initiatives have directed hundreds of billions toward domestic production. That's the argument many policymakers make, and they're not wrong. Money is being committed, factories are being announced, groundbreakings are happening. Yet there's a gap between announcing a factory and operating one. Sometimes a very large gap. Permitting processes, environmental reviews, local opposition, legal disputes, labor shortages, infrastructure bottlenecks, each step adds months or years. Individually, many of those rules exist for understandable reasons. Collectively, they create something else entirely. Delay. Lots of it. One of the more ironic aspects of modern industrial policy is that governments can agree they want more manufacturing while simultaneously maintaining systems that make building manufacturing extraordinarily slow. It's a bit like declaring a housing shortage and then holding a 5-year meeting about whether construction should begin. The shortage doesn't wait, neither does the market. And this brings us to the question that almost nobody asks directly. What if the most important economic competition between China and America isn't about technology? What if it isn't about military power? What if it's something far simpler? What if it's about which system can turn decisions into physical reality faster? Because once you start looking at factory construction through that lens, the numbers become far more significant than they first appear. And one industry in particular reveals why this race may already be further along than most people realize. Let's focus on one industry for a moment. Not because it's the only one that matters, because it exposes the entire mechanism: electric vehicles. A decade ago, many Western automakers viewed Chinese EV companies as ambitious newcomers. Interesting, perhaps, worth monitoring, but not necessarily a threat to established giants that had spent generations perfecting manufacturing. Today, that confidence looks much less comfortable. Companies like BYD are producing vehicles at a scale that would have seemed unrealistic just a few years ago. The company began as a battery manufacturer. That detail matters because batteries are not just another component in an EV. They're the heart of the economics. Control the battery, and suddenly the entire cost structure changes. Control the battery supply chain, and the advantage becomes even larger. China spent years building that supply chain, not months, years. Mining investments, refining capacity, chemical processing, battery manufacturing, component production, vehicle assembly, one layer connected to the next. This is where many discussions become misleading. People often compare a Chinese factory to an American factory as if they're competing in isolation. They're not. They're competing as ecosystems. Imagine two restaurants. One grows its own vegetables, owns the trucks delivering supplies, trains its own chefs, and sits next to its suppliers. The other buys everything from somewhere else. Even if both restaurants are equally talented, one starts every morning with an advantage. Manufacturing works the same way, and China understood that earlier than most countries. The result is visible in export numbers, production capacity, and pricing power. But here's the interesting twist. This wasn't achieved purely through cheap labor. That's an outdated explanation. Chinese manufacturing wages have risen significantly over the past 2 decades. If low wages were the entire story, production would already have migrated elsewhere. Instead, many industries stayed. Why? Because productivity matters, infrastructure matters, supplier density matters, time matters. A factory manager waiting 3 days for a component is operating in a completely different reality than one who receives it within hours. Those efficiencies sound boring until they start determining billion-dollar investment decisions. And investors notice, always. Consider what happened after the COVID-era supply chain disruptions. Governments across Europe and North America suddenly realized how dependent they were on manufacturing networks located thousands of miles away. For a brief moment, there was widespread talk of reshoring, bringing production home, reducing dependence, building resilience. Again, some of that happened. But something else happened too. Many companies examined the costs, timelines, and complexity involved in relocating large-scale production, and quietly concluded that moving an entire industrial ecosystem is much harder than moving a single factory. A semiconductor facility can be built. Replicating decades of accumulated suppliers, engineers, logistics systems, and specialized expertise is another challenge entirely. This is why announcements can sometimes create a misleading picture. A government announces a new plant. Headlines celebrate. Politicians hold press conferences. Everyone takes photographs wearing hard hats. Then, reality arrives. Permits, construction delays, cost overruns, supply bottlenecks, labor shortages, years pass. Meanwhile, somewhere in China, another industrial park is already operating. Another is expanding. A third is being planned. And the gap widens incrementally rather than dramatically. That's what makes this story easy to miss. People expect industrial decline or industrial growth to look dramatic. Usually, it doesn't. It looks like hundreds of small decisions accumulating over time. One permit approved faster, one supplier built closer, one rail connection completed sooner, one investment that chose certainty over uncertainty. Then, 10 years later, everyone notices the outcome. There's another layer here that deserves attention. Because if China's factory boom were only about exports, the story would be simpler. But many of these facilities are also targeting domestic demand. China's internal market remains enormous. That gives manufacturers something many competitors don't have: scale before they even export. A company can refine production, lower costs, improve technology, and expand output while selling into a market of hundreds of millions of consumers. That's a powerful advantage. Yet this is where the story becomes more complicated than either side likes to admit. Because despite all this factory construction, China also faces serious economic pressures. Property market weakness, local government debt, demographic challenges, consumer confidence concerns. Those problems are real. Which raises a question. If China is building factories at a historic pace while simultaneously dealing with economic headwinds, what exactly is Beijing preparing for? Because the answer isn't as straightforward as more exports. And once you examine where many of these new factories are actually being built, the entire picture starts to look very different. There's a tempting explanation for all of this. China is building factories because it wants to dominate exports. Simple, clean, easy to understand. The problem is that reality is messier. Remember the number from the opening? 68% of the world's new factory construction. If this were only about shipping more products overseas, the scale wouldn't make much sense. Global demand isn't growing fast enough to absorb endless new production without consequences. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question policymakers from Washington to Brussels are increasingly debating. What happens when a country builds more industrial capacity than the rest of the world expects it to need? The answer depends on who you ask. Critics argue China is creating overcapacity. They point to sectors like electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and industrial equipment, where production capability appears to be expanding faster than global demand. Chinese officials reject that argument entirely. Their position is different. They argue the world is underestimating future demand for clean energy, electrification, advanced manufacturing, and infrastructure. From Beijing's perspective, they aren't building too much. Everyone else is building too little. And honestly, both sides have a point. The transition toward electric transport, renewable energy, data centers, robotics, and AI infrastructure will require enormous industrial output over the next 2 decades. Yet it's also true that if supply grows faster than demand, prices fall. When prices fall, weaker competitors struggle. That's where things become geopolitical. A factory isn't just an economic asset anymore. It's increasingly becoming a strategic asset. Look at solar panels. Years ago, Western companies led much of the industry. Then Chinese firms expanded aggressively, scaled production, lowered costs, and eventually captured dominant market share. Consumers benefited from cheaper solar technology. Many Western manufacturers disappeared. Both things happened simultaneously. That's an important distinction because discussions about industrial competition often assume there's a single winner and a single loser. Reality tends to distribute gains and pain unevenly. Cheaper products help consumers. Lost factories hurt communities. Governments then have to decide which outcome matters more. And that's exactly the debate now spreading across multiple industries. But here's the reversal that makes this story more interesting. Many people see China's factory boom as evidence of unstoppable strength. I'm not completely convinced, at least not in the way it's commonly presented. Because building factories is easier than ensuring they remain profitable. A country can subsidize construction. It cannot permanently subsidize demand. Eventually, products must find buyers. Eventually, returns must justify investment. Eventually, economics catches up with strategy. History is full of examples. Japan in the 1980s, South Korea during certain industrial cycles, even the United States during periods of excessive investment. Industrial expansion creates winners. It also creates excesses. The challenge is identifying which projects belong in which category. This is why I think both the triumphalist and collapse narratives miss something important. China is neither 10 feet tall nor on the verge of failure. It's executing one of the largest industrial build-outs in modern history, while simultaneously navigating significant economic pressures at home. Both statements can be true. In fact, they are true. And this creates a dilemma for America. Because American policymakers can point to China's debt problems, demographic issues, and property sector troubles. Those concerns are legitimate. But a factory under construction doesn't stop being a factory because economists are worried about the housing market. Concrete keeps drying. Machines keep arriving. Workers keep getting hired. The physical economy continues moving. That's why the timing issue we discussed earlier matters so much. The Chinese system often prioritizes speed. The American system often prioritizes process. Each approach has strengths. Each has weaknesses. Speed can produce mistakes. Process can produce paralysis. The question isn't which model is morally superior. The question is which model produces the industrial base needed for the next economic era. Because while politicians debate trade policy and economists argue over forecasts, another transformation is quietly underway. Artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, automated manufacturing. The next generation of factories may require fewer workers than the factories of the past. And if that's true, then this entire competition changes shape. Suddenly, the critical question isn't who has cheaper labor, it's who has more factories, more energy, more industrial capacity, and more ability to deploy technology at scale. That's where this story stops being about today's economy and starts becoming a story about the economy of the 2030s. a future that is arriving much faster than most governments seem prepared for. The deeper I looked into this story, the less it seemed like a competition between China and America. It started looking like a competition between two clocks. One clock measures quarters, elections, public hearings, lawsuits, and regulatory reviews. The other measures decades. That's an oversimplification, of course. China makes costly mistakes. America remains the world's leader in many critical technologies. The United States still possesses extraordinary strengths: world-class universities, deep capital markets, unmatched research ecosystems, and some of the most innovative companies on Earth. This isn't a story about inevitable decline. It's a story about speed. And speed matters when the world is entering another industrial transition. Think about what is coming over the next 15 years. Artificial intelligence will require massive data centers. Data centers require power. Power requires transformers, cables, turbines, batteries, semiconductors, and industrial equipment. Electric vehicles require batteries. Batteries require chemicals, minerals, processing facilities, and factories. Robotics require sensors, motors, precision components, and manufacturing capacity. Every road eventually leads back to the physical economy. That's the point many people miss. For years, the conversation focused on software, apps, platforms, and digital services. Meanwhile, factories quietly return to the center of global power. Not because factories are glamorous, because somebody still has to build the machines that build the future. And right now, China is building a lot of those machines. More importantly, it's building the capacity to build even more later. That doesn't guarantee victory. History doesn't work that way. Industrial booms can create debt. Overcapacity can create financial stress. Geopolitical tensions can reshape trade flows overnight. There are real risks embedded in China's strategy. But there is also risk in assuming those problems will solve the challenge for everyone else. They won't. If a competitor is building factories faster than you, their mistakes do not automatically become your advantage. You still have to build. My prediction is relatively simple. Over the next decade, the defining economic battles won't be fought over who invents the next technology first. They'll be fought over who can manufacture it at scale, deploy it quickly, and make it affordable enough for the rest of the world to use. That's where this story leads. Remember the number from the beginning, 68%. That statistic isn't really about factories. It's a measurement of momentum. And momentum has a habit of becoming reality long before politicians, investors, and voters fully recognize what's happening. The future industrial map of the world is being drawn right now, one construction site at a time. The question isn't whether that map is changing. The question is, who notices early enough to respond? If you enjoyed this analysis, stick around. The next story is already taking shape, and it may be even bigger than this one. After all, while some countries are debating the future, others are already pouring the concrete.